Yasmeen, another week when we have to open this topic with news of migrants drowning while trying to cross. Reports out that the 6 people who lost their lives were from Afghanistan. Does this expose conclusively that inadequate, safe and legal routes lead directly to crossings?
It does, but I think in the way that all the other deaths that we've seen occur in the crossing in this past year and the years prior have. That's what's kind of so frustrating about these news items when they happen is that, we know exactly what's causing it. We know that these are vulnerable people who are risking their lives to take these very dangerous routes, who are putting their lives in the hands of these smugglers to seek a better life. And to your point, they're coming from Afghanistan. We know what they're probably fleeing. They're probably fleeing the Taliban. I think what's so sad is that, where only a couple of years ago when Kabul was falling, these are probably the kind of people that countries like the UK would seek to help. Unfortunately, the legal routes, the safe and legal routes for Afghans no longer exist the way it does, rightly so, for people coming from Ukraine, of course. But I think that's, and by that I mean rightly so that it exists for Ukrainians, not rightly so that there aren't avenues for people fleeing similar horrors elsewhere.
And it was always quite ludicrous, the Afghan route post-evacuation, right? Because it
Yeah, there's a
requires
lot of
you
problems.
to go outside the country to some consulate somewhere else and then go back in the country and wait for someone to say, yes, you can come. I mean, it's nonsense, isn't it?
I'm still in contact with one source that I remember interviewing when Kabul was falling in 2021. He was a Chevening scholar, so I believe he studied in Sussex and was kind of a leader of their alumni group in Afghanistan. And obviously this attracted the wrong kind of attention from the Taliban. And he and his family were, he was petitioning, emailing me and scores of others, ministers in the government, trying to make a case that, he's done a lot for the UK, that he should be able to go with the Chevening scholars, many of whom were thankfully taken out, the current Chevening scholars. He, and as far as I'm aware, last I spoke to him, he, his wife, and his children were never able to make it out of Afghanistan. He could be the very same people that end up making the very perilous decision to go on these boats. And I think, so obviously there's been a lot of response, since then, people rightfully criticizing the fact that there need to be more safe and legal routes. Of course, I think it's easy for both the Tories and Labour to kind of point the finger at the people smugglers and say, they're the problem. They're giving people these dangerous routes, and that's true. They are a problem, but I think you mitigate that problem and you make people less reliant on them when you do provide safe and legal routes. And the fact of the matter is that the UK government hasn't been able to do that. It could have been much worse. I think there were. I'm trying to remember the exact number, but there were, I want to say around 50 others who were saved. So 6 people died. It could have been a lot worse.
Yeah.
It's not for lack of trying. There were people on the French and UK side who were trying to save people. But the fact of the matter is this is just not sustainable.
Patricia from Bodmin left Nikki Campbell speechless on Friday when she called into Radio 5 Live to say, "It's very tough and I'm sorry there will be deaths, but that we shouldn't let boats land." These views may have always existed in the darker corners of pubs, but what does it mean that people feel they can now call into the BBC and just air them?
The wording is interesting that, these deaths will happen. It's very dehumanizing. And I think what unfortunately what's happened in the narrative around the boats in the UK is that it's been about boats. It's not been about people. It's a lot easier to point the finger and be like, these boats, these invaders are coming in, these physical vessels that are not human, without thinking about the people who are on them, the people who are, the vulnerable people, men, women, children. And I think, the government and even just the commentariat have a lot of responsibility, should be taking responsibility for the way that has been allowed to be spoken about. I think, she's echoing the wording that we're hearing from ministers, from our radios, not from wonderful podcasts such as this one, but, this is the conversation we've allowed ourselves to have.
Yeah.
And I think the more we strip human beings and real lives out of it, the further away it takes us from having a real humane solution.
Yes. Stop the desperate people is not as
Right?
catchy a
Yeah,
slogan, is
it's
it?
not. And I think she would struggle to say, look, women and children are going to die, but we can't let the boats come in. I don't think anyone would say that.
Ed, conventional wisdom would suggest that government directing everyone's attention to a complete skip fire over which it is presiding is not smart politics. The Sunday Times, however, has one insider explaining the strategy as taking the fight to areas Labour is vulnerable on, even if government is on shaky ground, helps Tories dictate the debate. What do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think for the tactics to work, it requires the British electorate to forget who's been in power for 13 years. You're saying these are the problem areas that we want to focus on, but don't ignore it, cause them. They are, because August is obviously a quiet week for British political journalism. It's a semi-smart play by the Conservatives to say, oh, today is this week, and then dictate the journalism around it. So we have people talking about it's Small Boats Week, Energy Week, now it's Health Week, and that is what's in the papers. And so if people are paying attention to those issues, what's interesting is I'm not sure they'll have a cost of living week. They're not going to have, in that there's a poll in the Mail on Sunday and a list of priorities of of important issues that people that matters to people. 69% of people said cost of living. The next highest one was NHS, which I think had 35% of people said the NHS. 10% said immigration and asylum. 2% said trans rights. So it's a complete distraction tactic from what the Conservatives are actually failing on.
The ONS figures for inflation are coming out on Wednesday, and there was a little scoop in the eye that suggests inflation has gone down by only 0.1%, which is not what they would be hoping, and that it's going to go up next month because of this little bump in spending during June. So I think they're getting a cost of living week, whether they want to or not this week.
But every week should be the cost of living week, which it shouldn't. I think it's kind of ludicrous that it is dictated by government spin. And then also, I suppose, I want to touch on the areas Labour is vulnerable on, because they say they're trying to paint Labour as like as if they're the political wing of Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil, when really they've probably got as much contempt for them as the Conservatives have. There actually isn't that much difference in terms of policy in a lot of these areas, especially when it comes to kind of they're kind of taking a neutral stance on a lot of small boats. They've talked about they've contextualised this, but they said they wouldn't immediately stop the use of the barges, primarily because you can't do anything overnight. Labour aren't going to come into power and fix the country, but they're trying to make Labour seem a lot more different to them than they actually probably are.